Welcome to our channel where we bring you the darkest, most chilling stories from the shadows of reality.
In 1982, a young couple, Ben and Sarah, moved into a charming Victorian house in the small town of Harrow Creek. The house was beautiful but had stood empty for years, the locals avoiding it due to strange rumors. The most peculiar one was about the attic window. Neighbors often claimed to see a shadowy figure standing there, staring out at the street, even though the house was unoccupied. Ben and Sarah, skeptical of ghost stories, dismissed the rumors as small-town superstition. They were thrilled to find such an affordable home and began renovating it immediately. For the first week, everything was idyllic. They painted walls, restored antique fixtures, and began settling into their new life. But then, the oddities started. Sarah was the first to notice. While gardening in the backyard, she glanced up and thought she saw someone move past the attic window. She froze, her heart pounding. Gathering her courage, she went inside and called for Ben. They searched the attic together, but it was empty save for dusty old furniture and a few cobwebs. That window's reflection must play tricks on you, Ben reasoned, though he avoided looking at it himself. The unease grew. At night, faint footsteps echoed through the house, always seeming to come from above. Doors left open would creak shut, and Sarah swore she heard whispering when she passed the staircase leading to the attic. Ben, ever the skeptic, insisted it was just the house settling, but he too began to feel watched. One evening, Sarah was home alone. Ben had gone to a late meeting, and she decided to relax with a book in the living room. As she read, a sound made her blood turn cold, a rhythmic tapping on the window. She hesitated, then pulled back the curtain, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind. But there was no tree, no branch, and no one outside. Her gaze drifted upward, and there it was, the attic window. A shadowy figure stood there, staring directly at her. She screamed and called Ben, begging him to come home. When he arrived, the attic was empty yet again. But this time, they noticed something new. A set of child-sized footprints in the thick layer of dust on the attic floor. The couple decided to install cameras throughout the house, hoping to catch a rational explanation. Days passed with no incidents until one night, they reviewed the footage. At precisely 3:13 a.m., the camera in the hallway leading to the attic caught movement. A small, shadowy figure, humanoid but not quite right, crawled down the attic stairs on all fours before disappearing into the shadows. Terrified, Ben and Sarah contacted a local historian who specialized in the town's past. He revealed a chilling story. In 1907, a recluse named Abigail lived in the house with her son, Peter. Abigail was rumored to be unhinged, keeping Peter locked in the attic his entire life. One winter, neighbors noticed they hadn't seen either of them for weeks. When authorities entered the home, they found Abigail dead of illness and Peter's body in the attic. He had starved to death, claw marks covering the door and walls where he had tried to escape. The couple moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The house remains unsold to this day. Neighbors still report seeing the figure in the attic window and hearing faint tapping late at night. Those who dare to look too long say the figure eventually turns to face them and smiles. In a small Appalachian town, surrounded by dense forests and misty mountains, there was a cliffside known as Dead Man's Bluff. Locals avoided it at all costs, especially at night. Stories whispered through generations told of hikers disappearing, eerie cries echoing through the woods, and strange figures seen on the edge of the cliff. In the summer of 1994, 3 friends, Sam, Emily, and Jake, decided to test the legend. They were avid hikers and amateur ghost hunters, equipped with a camcorder, flashlights, and a bit too much bravado. The plan was simple: camp overnight near the bluff and document any strange occurrences. As they trekked up the winding path, the air grew colder, and the dense canopy of trees seemed to blot out the setting sun. Emily noted how eerily quiet the woods were. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. They reached the bluff by twilight and set up their campsite. The view from the edge was breathtaking, but the sheer drop into the shadowy abyss below sent shivers down their spines. The night began uneventfully. They laughed, told stories, and filmed the surroundings. Around midnight, however, things took a turn. Emily claimed to hear whispers, faint and indecipherable, as if coming from the void beyond the cliff. Jake brushed it off, teasing her about letting the ghost stories get to her. But then, Sam spotted something, a pale figure, standing motionless at the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. They called out, but the figure didn't respond. Jake aimed the camcorder toward it, but when he looked through the viewfinder, the figure wasn't there. Weird, he muttered, lowering the camera. When he looked back, the figure had vanished entirely. Unease settled over the group. They decided to pack up and leave. But as they turned away from the cliff, a loud, guttural scream pierced the silence. It wasn't human. It was something primal, something that made their blood run cold. The camcorder's microphone captured it in chilling clarity. Panicking, they hurriedly gathered their things. Sam led the way down the trail, flashlight trembling in his hand. But as they moved deeper into the woods, the path seemed to change, twisting and leading them in circles. The trees began to close in, their gnarled branches resembling clawed hands reaching for them. Then they noticed Emily wasn't with them. They shouted her name, their voices echoing back mockingly. Sam and Jake retraced their steps, frantic, until they heard her scream. This time, unmistakably human. They ran toward the sound and found her near the edge of the cliff, staring into the void. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her lips moved as if she were speaking to someone unseen. "Emily!" Sam shouted, grabbing her arm. She snapped out of it and screamed, "It wants me to jump." They pulled her away, but she kept whispering, "It's in my head. It's in my head." The three of them eventually found their way back to town, shaken and disoriented. They handed the camcorder to the local authorities, who reviewed the footage. The video captured strange anomalies, flickering lights, shadowy figures darting just out of frame, and, most chillingly, a distorted voice whispering, "Come closer." Emily moved away from the town shortly after, plagued by nightmares and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Sam and Jake stopped speaking of the incident entirely. Years later, hikers reported seeing a young woman standing at the edge of Dead Man's Bluff, staring into the void. When approached, she would vanish, leaving only the faint sound of whispers behind. In 1979, the town of Black Hollow was rocked by the sudden disappearance of a teenage boy named Tommy Grayson. Tommy was last seen near Black Hollow Lake, a tranquil body of water surrounded by thick woods. The lake was a local favorite for fishing and swimming, but it also had a darker reputation. People whispered about the Whispering Lady, a ghostly figure said to lure people into the water, never to be seen again. Tommy's body was never found, and his disappearance became just another grim story tied to the lake. Decades later, in 2015, a group of 4 friends, Megan, Chris, Julia, and Tyler, rented a cabin near Black Hollow Lake for a weekend getaway. They'd heard the eerie stories but brushed them off as small-town folklore. The lake, they thought, would be the perfect escape from city life. The first day was picturesque. The group kayaked, fished, and grilled on the shore. By nightfall, they were sitting around a campfire, sharing drinks and ghost stories. Chris, ever the skeptic, laughed at the legend of the Whispering Lady. "People just make up these stories to scare themselves," he said. "There's no ghost, no curse, just a creepy old lake." As if on cue, the wind picked up, carrying an eerie sound, a soft, lilting voice. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Megan whispered. "It's the wind," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. The voice grew clearer, like a woman singing a lullaby. It seemed to come from the direction of the lake. Against their better judgment, they walked to the shore, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The water was still, reflecting the pale moonlight, but the singing persisted. Then they saw her. Standing waist-deep in the lake was a woman with long dark hair cascading over her face. She wore a tattered white dress that floated around her like mist. The singing stopped abruptly as she turned her head, revealing hollow, black eyes. "Run!" Megan gasped, but her voice felt distant, as if swallowed by the heavy air. Chris, frozen in place, took a step toward the lake. "She's calling me," he murmured. Tyler and Julia grabbed him, pulling him back. The woman began to move toward the shore, her movements unnaturally fluid. The water around her boiled and churned as if alive. Without another word, the group bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door and locking it behind them. Inside, they tried to make sense of what they had seen. Chris, now trembling, admitted he had felt something pulling him, like invisible hands dragging him toward the water. The voice, he said, had promised peace, warmth, and answers to questions he didn't even know he had. They agreed to leave first thing in the morning, but the lake had other plans. At 3:15 a.m., Megan woke to the sound of splashing outside. Peeking out the window, she saw Chris standing at the shore, staring out at the lake. His movements were stiff, almost puppet-like, as he waded into the water. "Chris!" she screamed, waking the others. They rushed out, but by the time they reached the water's edge, Chris was gone. The surface of the lake was still, as if he had never been there at all. The group called the authorities, who launched a search at dawn. Divers scoured the lake for days but found no trace of Chris. Heartbroken and terrified, Megan, Julia, and Tyler left Black Hollow Lake, vowing never to return. Years later, Megan heard of another disappearance, a young woman who had rented the same cabin. Witnesses claimed she'd been heard talking to someone unseen near the lake before walking into the water and vanishing. To this day, locals say if you stand on the shore of Black Hollow Lake at night, you can hear the soft singing of the Whispering Lady. Those who linger too long might see her and feel her pull them into the depths.